There are few things in this world more stubbornly persistent than a homeowners association with a grudge. They operate with the slow, grinding certainty of glacier, convinced of their own righteousness and armed with a binder of bylaws thick enough to stop a door or a heart. My name is Arthur Vance, and for 30 years, I was a high school history teacher. I lived a quiet life on a 5-acre plot of land that had been in my family for 4 generations, a small island of green nestled at the edge of a sprawling, beige-colored suburban development called Willow Creek Estates. My personal peace treaty with the world was simple. Leave me to my books and my garden, and I'll leave you to yours. But the Willow Creek HOA and its imperious president, a man named Gerald Abernathy, had other plans. It began with a letter delivered in a crisp, professionally printed envelope that felt menacingly official. It informed me, in no uncertain terms, that the barn at the far edge of my property was in violation of several community aesthetic codes. The letter stated the structure was dilapidated, an eyesore, and inconsistent with the modern architectural standards of the community. The final paragraph was a punch to the gut. I had 90 days to have the structure professionally demolished and the site cleared. Failure to comply would result in escalating daily fines and eventually a lien on my property. That barn wasn't just a structure. My grandfather built it with his own hands over a century ago. It was where my father taught me how to work with wood, where I'd stored decades of memories, and where my late wife, Eleanor, had cultivated her prize-winning orchids. Every weathered plank and rusted hinge told a story. To Abernathy, it was a blemish. To me, it was the soul of my home. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that they weren't just picking a fight with a retired teacher. They were picking a fight with history itself. They saw an old barn. I saw a legacy. And as a historian, I knew that the best way to protect a legacy is to prove its worth. They thought their bylaws were the ultimate authority, but I was about to introduce them to a much higher power, the historical record. Have you ever been told that something you love is worthless? This is the story of how I proved that the value of heritage can't be measured in property values or dictated by a committee of petty tyrants. The first step in any conflict is to attempt diplomacy, even if you suspect it's a futile exercise. I attended the next monthly HOA meeting held in the sterile, beige community center that perfectly embodied their worldview. I came prepared not with anger, but with reason. I brought a framed photograph of my grandparents standing proudly in front of the newly completed barn circa 1920. I spoke of its role in my family, of its structural integrity, which I'd maintained myself, and of its sentimental value. I made a calm, logical appeal to their sense of community, suggesting that a true community respects the history of the land it occupies. Gerald Abernathy, a man whose posture seemed permanently locked in a state of condescending disapproval, listened with a thin, dismissive smile. When I finished, he didn't even look at my photograph. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice dripping with false patience, "while your personal anecdotes are charming, they are irrelevant. The bylaws are clear. The structure is non-compliant. It's an eyesore, and it negatively impacts the property values of your neighbors." A few heads in the audience nodded in sycophantic agreement. I tried a different tack. "Mr. Abernathy, the barn predates this entire development, and the HOA itself, by nearly 80 years. Surely there's a grandfather clause," he scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "The moment your property was incorporated into the boundaries of the development plat, all structures became subject to the covenant. Rules are rules." The meeting was a bust. My appeal to heart and history had crashed against a wall of bureaucratic indifference. The 90-day clock was ticking, and with every tick, the fines would begin to mount. That night, I sat in my study, the threatening letter on the desk in front of me, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounding more like a countdown timer. I felt a surge of frustration, but it was quickly replaced by a familiar feeling from my teaching days, the thrill of a research challenge. Abernathy and his board saw the barn as a liability. I had to prove it was an asset. But how? My mind drifted back to stories my grandfather used to tell, hazy memories from my childhood. He'd spoken of the barn being used for more than just storing hay and equipment. He mentioned important visitors and quiet meetings during a troubled time. As a boy, I dismissed it as romantic exaggeration. But now, as a historian, my curiosity was piqued. What troubled time was he talking about? I pulled out old county maps and property deeds, tracing my family's ownership back. I cross-referenced the dates with major historical events of the region. The barn was built just after the First World War, during a period of immense social and political change. The area, now a suburban paradise, was once rural farmland, but it was also on a key transportation route between major cities. The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but the outline of a puzzle was beginning to form. It was then that the idea, bold and perhaps a little mad, struck me. If there was a hidden history in that barn, I wouldn't find it in a book. I would find it in the ground, in the walls, in the very soil it stood on. Abernathy wanted to bring in a demolition crew. I decided I would bring in an archaeologist. It was a long shot, a gamble that would cost me money I barely had. But the alternative, watching a bulldozer tear down my family's history, was unthinkable. My quiet retirement was officially over. I was now the lead investigator in the most important historical query of my life. Finding an archaeologist willing to take on a speculative dig for a private citizen on a tight deadline isn't as simple as a web search. Most are affiliated with universities or museums, booked years in advance for major institutional projects. I spent days making calls, facing a series of polite but firm rejections. They needed grant proposals, peer-reviewed justifications, and preliminary evidence, none of which I had. All I had was a gut feeling and a collection of my grandfather's folksy anecdotes. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, a former student of mine, now a tenured professor of American Studies at the State University, gave me a name, Dr. Isabel Reyes. She's brilliant, a bit of maverick, my student told me. She specializes in vernacular architecture and the archaeology of marginalized histories. If anyone will be interested in the story of a common barn, it's her. I reached out to Dr. Reyes, sending a carefully worded email that outlined my situation, the HOA's threat, and my suspicion that the barn was more than it seemed. To my surprise, she responded within hours, her curiosity evidently piqued. We met for coffee the next day. Dr. Reyes was a woman in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to analyze everything. She listened intently as I recounted my grandfather's stories and laid out the HOA's demolition order. I expected skepticism, but instead, I saw a flicker of intrigue. "Mr. Vance," she said, setting her mug down. 99 times out of 100, an old barn is just an old barn. But history is found in the 1% cases. The stories that aren't written down, the meetings that happened in secret, because the participants were afraid of being seen. She explained that the period after World War I was a hotbed of social movements, many of which operated on the fringes. Prohibition was in full swing. The women's suffrage movement had just secured the vote, but faced immense backlash, and labor movements were organizing in secret. Your grandfather's important visitors could have been anyone. She agreed to conduct a preliminary, non-invasive survey of the site. It would involve ground-penetrating radar to look for soil disturbances or buried objects, and a meticulous architectural analysis of the barn itself. It was expensive, but it was my only shot. If we find anything, she cautioned, anything at all that suggests historical significance, we can petition the State Historic Preservation Office for a temporary stay on the demolition order pending a full investigation. It's a legal maneuver, but it requires evidence the plan was set. As Dr. Reyes and her small team of graduate students prepared to begin their work, the pressure from Abernathy and the HOA intensified. He started driving by my property slowly, a smug look on his face, occasionally stopping to stare at the barn as if willing it to crumble. I received another letter, this one informing me that the first round of fines had been levied against my account. They were digging in, confident in their victory. They saw an old man getting desperate. They didn't see the quiet, methodical work of a professional historian about to uncover their worst nightmare. My strategy was no longer just about saving the barn. It was about unearthing a truth so powerful it would make their petty bylaws look as foolish and insignificant as they truly were. While I was pinning my hopes on Dr. Reyes and her scientific equipment, Gerald Abernathy was growing bolder. His victory seemed assured, and he began to act like a conquering general surveying his prize. One afternoon, I saw him standing at the edge of my property line with another man, a slick-looking individual in a suit who carried a portfolio. It was a developer who had been sniffing around the area for months. Abernathy was pointing directly at my barn, talking animatedly, a greedy glint in his eye. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about community standards, this was about clearing the way for a lucrative land deal. My 5-acre plot, with the eyesore barn removed, would be a prime target for another cul-de-sac of McMansions. Abernathy wasn't just a petty tyrant. He was a motivated one. His arrogance was my only advantage. He was so convinced of his power, so sure that his rulebook was the only one that mattered, that he never once considered I might be playing a different game entirely. He saw my hiring of Dr. Reyes, which he'd undoubtedly heard about through the neighborhood gossip mill, as the last, pathetic act of a desperate man. He likely imagined her finding nothing more than some old farming tools and a few rusty nails. The thought that she might uncover something that could derail his plans never entered his mind. Meanwhile, Dr. Reyes and her team got to work. They arrived with a van full of equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. They set up a precise grid system around the barn and began the survey. The ground-penetrating radar machine, a device that looked like a futuristic lawnmower, was pushed slowly back and forth across the yard, its screen displaying cryptic squiggles and shadows that were meaningless to me, but which Dr. Reyes studied with intense focus. For 2 days, they found nothing. The radar showed compacted soil, a few buried field stones, but no significant anomalies. My heart sank with every passing hour. The demolition deadline was looming, and my savings were dwindling. Abernathy even had the gall to walk over one afternoon, feigning neighborly concern. "Quite the operation you have here, Vance," he said, smirking at the students meticulously marking their grid. "Finding any buried treasure?" The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife. I simply smiled politely. "History is its own treasure, Mr. Abernathy." He chuckled and walked away, shaking his head. It was on the 3rd day that Dr. Reyes shifted her focus from the surrounding ground to the interior of the barn itself. She was particularly interested in the floor. While most of it was packed earth, one corner section was covered with thick, heavy oak planks that my grandfather had always used as a workspace. "This flooring is different," she noted, tapping it with her foot. "It's not original to the main construction. It was added later." Her team used pry bars to carefully lift the heavy planks. Beneath them was not dirt, but another layer of carefully laid subflooring. And beneath that, they found it. The ground-penetrating radar had missed it, shielded by the dense layers of wood. It was a dark, rectangular shape, a soil disturbance, a pit. My breath caught in my throat. Dr. Reyes's usual professional composure gave way to visible excitement. "Get the brushes," she said to her students, her voice low and urgent. "Gently." We worked gently. As they carefully brushed away decades of packed dirt, the outline became clearer. It was a wooden chest, bound in iron straps, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was old, clearly handmade, and locked with a large, rusted padlock. We had found something. We still didn't know what it was, but for the first time in months, I felt a surge of genuine hope. The game had changed. The discovery of the chest was the fulcrum on which the entire battle would turn. Dr. Reyes immediately documented the find with photographs and detailed notes. Citing the potential significance of a deliberately concealed artifact, she filed an emergency petition with the State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO. As she had predicted, the SHPO responded swiftly, issuing a legally binding 30-day stay on any alteration or demolition of the structure and the surrounding site, pending an official assessment. I hand-delivered a copy of the stay order to Gerald Abernathy's doorstep. I didn't ring the bell. I simply tucked the official document, with its state seal and authoritative legal language, into the handle of his front door. I imagine the look on his face when he found it, the confusion, the flicker of annoyance, and then the slow dawning rage as he realized his 90-day countdown had been officially halted by a power far greater than his HOA board. His response was predictable. He called an emergency HOA meeting, framing it as an informational session to address the deliberate and obstructive tactics of a non-compliant resident. The notice he sent out was dripping with indignation, portraying me as a troublemaker wasting community time and resources to protect an ugly, unsafe building. He was trying to rally public opinion against me, to paint me as the villain before the contents of the chest were even known. He was confident he could still win in the court of neighborhood opinion. What he failed to grasp was that the story was no longer about him or me. It was about the chest. Dr. Reyes, following strict archaeological protocols, had the chest carefully transported to her university lab for opening and analysis. The rusted padlock was so corroded that it had to be painstakingly removed by a conservation specialist. I was there, in the sterile quiet of the lab, when the heavy lid was finally lifted. The air inside smelled of old paper, dry leather, and time itself. The contents were wrapped in oilcloth, remarkably well preserved from the dampness of the earth. Dr. Reyes, wearing white cotton gloves, began to carefully remove the items one by one. There were stacks of pamphlets, their titles printed in bold, urgent letters. Votes for Women, and an address to the Daughters of Liberty. There were bundles of letters, tied with faded ribbon, written in elegant, forceful cursive. There was a small, leather-bound diary, and at the very bottom, nestled in the cloth, was a framed photograph. It showed a group of about a dozen women standing in front of my family's barn. They were dressed in the fashion of the early 1920s, their faces a mixture of solemnity and fierce determination. And there, standing slightly in front of the group, was a face I recognized from every history book I had ever taught. The sharp features, the determined jaw, the iconic wire-rimmed glasses of Susan B. Anthony. My grandfather's stories hadn't been exaggerations. They had been understatements. Dr. Reyes and her team worked feverishly, cross-referencing the names in the letters and diary with historical records. The picture became astonishingly clear. In the years immediately following the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, the fight was far from over. Activists faced intense opposition and violence as they worked to register new voters and combat discriminatory practices. My barn, conveniently located and owned by my sympathetic and discreet great-grandparents, had served as a secret regional headquarters for the National Woman's Party. The chest contained meeting minutes, strategic plans for voter registration drives, and personal letters detailing the threats and intimidation they faced. The barn wasn't just old. It was a front line in one of America's most important civil rights struggles. It was a monument to the courage of women who risked everything for a voice. Abernathy was about to go to war not with an old man, but with the legacy of the suffragettes. It was a battle he was destined to lose spectacularly. The emergency HOA meeting was Abernathy's chosen battlefield. He intended for it to be my public execution, a forum where he would expose my frivolous delays and consolidate his power. The community center was packed, a mix of his loyalists, curious onlookers, and a few neighbors who had always been kind to me. Abernathy stood at the podium, radiating smug authority. He had his binder of bylaws, his gavel, and what he believed was the moral high ground. He began his speech with a flourish, talking about the importance of rules, progress, and maintaining the pristine character of Willow Creek Estates. He painted me as a sentimental old fool, clinging to a worthless relic at the expense of his neighbors. Mr. Vance is engaged in costly legal maneuvers to halt the lawful enforcement of our community covenants, he declared, his voice ringing with theatrical gravitas. He has brought in outside agitators to create a fiction, a fantasy, all to avoid his responsibility. He gestured vaguely in my direction, where I sat in the front row, waiting patiently. I was not alone. Beside me sat Dr. Isabel Reyes, her briefcase on her lap. And on my other side was a calm, distinguished woman named Mrs. Peterson, the director of the State Historic Preservation Office. Abernathy hadn't noticed them yet. He was too consumed by his own performance. He finally turned his attention to me. "So, Mr. Vance," he said, the sneer returning to his face, "do you have anything to say for yourself before this board votes to impose the maximum allowable fines and pursue immediate legal action to compel demolition?" This was my cue. I stood up, but I didn't walk to the podium. I simply remained by my chair. "I do, Mr. Abernathy. But it's not just my voice you'll be hearing tonight." I turned and nodded to Dr. Reyes. She stood and walked to the podium. Abernathy looked momentarily confused, then annoyed. "Excuse me, this is a closed meeting for residents. I believe you'll find I'm an invited guest," Dr. Reyes said coolly, opening her briefcase. As she began to speak, a side door to the community center opened. A local news cameraman and a reporter slipped inside, followed by another team from a major city affiliate. The university's press office, tipped off by Dr. Reyes, had done its job. The color drained from Abernathy's face. This was no longer his controlled environment. The narrative was being ripped from his hands. Dr. Reyes began her presentation. She was a phenomenal public speaker, clear, concise, and compelling. She didn't just present facts, she told a story. She spoke of the post-suffrage era, of the brave women who continued the fight. Then, she put the photograph on the projector. The image of the dozen women, with Susan B. Anthony at the fore, filled the screen behind Abernathy. My barn was their backdrop. A collective gasp went through the room. The structure Mr. Abernathy has referred to as an eyesore and a relic is, in fact, the last surviving clandestine meeting house for the National Woman's Party in this state, Dr. Reyes announced, her voice resonating with historical weight. The chest we unearthed contained priceless, unpublished documents detailing their strategies, their struggles, and their triumphs. The room was silent, the residents staring at the photograph, then at me, then at the sputtering, dumbfounded man at the podium. Abernathy was trapped, illuminated by the projection of the very history he had tried to erase. The reveal was a bomb, and Abernathy was standing at ground zero. His face cycled through a rapid progression of emotions: shock, disbelief, then a desperate, flailing denial. "This is absurd," he sputtered, turning to the audience as if seeking an ally in his collapsing reality. "It's a trick, a doctored photo. He's trying to manufacture a history to get out of his obligations." But his protests were hollow. His authority instantly evaporated. Mrs. Peterson from the State Historic Preservation Office rose from her seat. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the room with absolute authority. "I can assure you, Mr. Abernathy, the evidence is authentic. My office, in conjunction with Dr. Reyes's team, an expert from the National Archives, has authenticated the documents and the photograph. The diary entries align perfectly with Susan B. Anthony's known travel itineraries from that period." She turned her gaze from Abernathy to the stunned residents. "What Mr. Vance has on his property is not a dilapidated structure. It is a site of profound national significance. A place where the course of American democracy was shaped." The news cameras zoomed in on Abernathy's face, now a blotchy canvas of crimson and white. The reporter began peppering him with questions. "Mr. Abernathy, were you aware of the barn's history when you ordered its demolition? Is it the HOA's policy to destroy historic landmarks? What about your meeting with the developer? Was this demolition order intended to clear the land for a new project?" That last question hit him like a physical blow. His eyes darted nervously towards the developer's local agent, who was trying to shrink into the back wall. The connection had been made, not by me, but by an enterprising journalist in front of the entire community. Abernathy's petty crusade was now exposed for what it likely was: a grubby scheme for personal gain, wrapped in a flag of property values. He banged his gavel weakly. "This meeting is adjourned," he shouted, but no one was listening. The residents were swarming me and Dr. Reyes. Their expressions changed from suspicion to awe and, in many cases, embarrassment. People who had nodded along with Abernathy's denunciations were now shaking my hand, apologizing, and asking to hear more about the barn's incredible story. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Abernathy, the man who held all the power just 30 minutes earlier, was now a pariah in his own kingdom, scurrying out a side door to escape the cameras and the accusing stares of his neighbors. I stood there, watching him go, feeling not malice, but a profound sense of vindication. I had fought back not with anger or threats, but with knowledge. I had used the very thing I dedicated my life to, history, as my weapon and my shield. The barn was safe. Its story, once hidden in a buried chest, was now being broadcast across the state. My personal fight had become a public triumph, and the legacy of those brave women was finally, after a century of silence, being brought into the light. The fallout for Gerald Abernathy was swift and total. The story exploded. It was picked up by national news outlets and wire services. The narrative was irresistible. Petty HOA tyrant tries to demolish national treasure for profit. Photos of my humble, weathered barn were juxtaposed with the iconic image of the suffragettes standing before it. Abernathy became a caricature of bureaucratic overreach and greed. The developer he'd been courting publicly disavowed any knowledge of the demolition order and immediately withdrew their interest in the area, not wanting to be associated with such a public relations disaster. Humiliation was only the beginning. An internal investigation by a newly formed HOA oversight committee, prompted by outraged residents, uncovered evidence that Abernathy had indeed been promised a substantial finder's fee by the developer if my land could be acquired. Faced with accusations of fraud and a complete loss of face, he resigned from the HOA presidency in disgrace and put his house on the market within a month. The old board was dissolved, and a new one was elected, composed of residents who actually valued the idea of community over the sterile enforcement of rules. My first order of business with the new board was a motion to formally rescind all fines against me and to amend the bylaws to include protections for historical and heritage structures. It passed unanimously. The victory, however, was far bigger than just me and my property. The barn was officially designated a state and national historic landmark. A formal ceremony was held a few months later. The governor attended, along with senators and descendants of the very women whose letters we had found in the chest. They stood on a temporary stage set up in my yard, speaking of courage, perseverance, and the importance of preserving the physical markers of our past. Dr. Reyes gave a moving speech about how history is not just in grand monuments, but in humble places, in the quiet corners where brave people do extraordinary things. A bronze plaque was unveiled and mounted on the barn's thick oak door. It read, "The Willow Creek Suffrage Barn." In this structure, from 1920 to 1924, leaders of the National Woman's Party secretly met to champion and secure the voting rights of American women. May this place stand as a testament to their courage and a reminder that the fight for liberty requires a safe harbor. The barn itself was transformed. With grants from historical societies and private donations, it was carefully restored, not modernized, but stabilized. Every weathered plank was preserved, every rusted hinge left in place. It was now a living museum, a place for school groups and visitors to come and learn about a vital, hidden chapter of their own history. My quiet life had been upended, but in its place, I found a new sense of purpose. I became the barn's unofficial curator and storyteller, sharing its history with a new generation. In the end, Gerald Abernathy's attempt to erase a piece of my family's history resulted in it being enshrined forever. His obsession with a superficial, modern aesthetic led directly to the preservation of something authentically, powerfully old. The irony was not lost on me. He wanted to tear down the barn to increase property values. But by turning it into a national landmark, I had arguably made the entire neighborhood more culturally significant and desirable than his beige conformity ever could have. The change in the community was palpable. Neighbors who had once only given curt nods now stopped to talk, to ask about the barn, to share their own family stories. The HOA meetings, once arenas of petty conflict, became productive conversations about building a better, more interesting community. They even started a neighborhood historical society. The whole affair reaffirmed a lesson I had tried to impart to my students for 30 years. History is not a static collection of dates and dead people. It is a living, breathing force that shapes our present and informs our future. It's a source of identity, strength, and context. To ignore it, or worse, to deliberately destroy it, is to sever our own roots. Abernathy saw a dilapidated building. He was blind to the legacy it contained. He saw a nuisance, not a narrative. His world was circumscribed by the narrow margins of his bylaws, while the barn story was part of the grand, sprawling text of the nation itself. My fight was never just about wooden nails. It was about the principle that value cannot always be measured financially. It was about defending the intangible, memory, heritage, and the stories that make us who we are. I had simply used the tools I knew best: research, evidence, and a deep and abiding respect for the past. I often sit on my porch now in the evenings, looking out at the barn as the sun sets. The bronze plaque catches the last light, and I think of my grandparents, of my late wife Eleanor, and of the determined women in that old photograph. They all found shelter there, in their own ways. Thanks to a stubborn old history teacher and an arrogant HOA president, it would now shelter their stories for generations to come. I had won more than just a battle. I had helped preserve a victory. And in doing so, I had found my own. The dust has long since settled, both literally from the archaeological dig and figuratively from the community upheaval. The new HOA is a testament to the idea that governance can be about guidance rather than control. They even consult me on matters of local history now, a turn of events that would have been unimaginable under Abernathy's reign. He is gone, a footnote in the neighborhood story, a cautionary tale about the perils of arrogance. His name is only ever mentioned as the man who almost bulldozed a national treasure. My life found a new rhythm, one that harmonizes my desire for peace with my newfound role as a guardian of history. The barn is no longer just mine. It belongs to the story of the country. School buses now pull up my long driveway, and the sound of children learning about the suffragettes fills the air that once echoed only with the threat of demolition. I see the awe in their faces as they stand inside the barn, touching the rough-hewn walls where history was made in secret. It's a far greater legacy than I ever could have imagined. This entire ordeal taught me a powerful lesson, one that extends far beyond property disputes. It taught me that the systems and rules we live under are only as powerful as we allow them to be. When faced with an unjust decree, whether from an HOA or any other authority, there are often tools at our disposal that the opposition has never even considered. They expect a frontal assault, an angry shouting match. They don't expect a quiet, methodical flanking maneuver using archaeology, historical preservation law, and the power of a well-told story. My victory wasn't loud or violent. It was precise and irrefutable. It was a victory of depth over surface, of significance over aesthetics. The moral of this story isn't just that you should stand up to bullies. It's that the most effective way to do so is often by changing the very terms of the debate. Abernathy wanted to argue about bylaws. I chose to argue about national heritage. He brought a rule book to the fight. I brought the weight of history. It was never a fair contest. For anyone out there facing their own immovable obstacle or their own unbeatable bureaucracy, remember that the battlefield is often larger than you think. Look for the hidden leverage. Look for the truth your opponent has overlooked or disdained. The most powerful weapon is often the one they don't even recognize as a weapon. What piece of your own history, personal or communal, holds a value that others might not see? Never underestimate the power of unearthing it.